Yeah, thank you, Fyodor, for coming along to this meaningful conversation and joining us in this. Um, to start the conversation, Fyodor, I would like actually us to give us a little bit of introduction, who you are and what do you do, and a little bit of a story of what you are doing.
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, I'm Fyodor Ovchinnikov, and I was born in Russia, but I live in the San Francisco Bay Area over the last almost 10 years. And I'm a co-founder and managing partner of the Institute for Evolution Leadership with a mentor and a friend of mine, Manuel Manga, who came up with the concept of evolution leadership about 25, 30 years ago. And we are doing leadership development for systemic transformation. One of the insights that prompted Manuel to create this concept back in the early 90s is that he was acting as a management consultant in large organizations, including Digital Equipment Corporation and kind of the IBM of the time. And then he worked with the Society for Learning Organizations with Peter Senge and others in Boston for a long time as management consultant as well. And then he realized that by helping leaders be more effective within the current cultures and institutions, he's essentially helping them destroy the world. Because the cultures and institutions that were currently in place, and many of them are still in place, created a lot of existential threats to humanity and other life forms on the planet. And in the meantime, the focus of most leadership development is still helping people become successful within these cultures and institutions. So instead of keeping doing that, he decided to look at the toolkits he had and the wisdom and the insights that he used for leadership development to see which of those insights and frameworks and tools and theories could be applied to actively redesigning existing cultures and institutions rather than just succeeding blindly in what we have. And he called that evolution leadership because because the invitation is to contribute consciously into a social evolution. Because social evolution is happening. We live in societies that are very different from what we had 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So social evolution is a reality. But most of the time, this evolution is unconscious. It's an emergent property of individual actions and some visions, and very few people actually think about the direction, the overall direction of that evolution. The invitation of evolution leadership is to think consciously about where are we going as communities and societies and the humanity, and align whatever you're doing with whatever you sense would bring us all to a better future. Yeah, and that's what we do through educational programs, through creating support structures for leaders who are doing that, including Evolution Future Challenge and different forms of collaborative funding for projects that are not very much aligned with the mainstream funding options, things like that.
Yeah. So and then what is your story? How your path came across to the evolution leadership?
Sure. Yeah. Right. So there are three main lines that brought me to this work. One is my academic studies. I studied resilience of the socioeconomic system of China at Moscow University, and around my master's studies, I was trying to figure out what is the socioeconomic system ontologically. So I wrote this paper, philosophic paper about that for my philosophy course, and discovered for myself something that had been discovered long ago by people like Fernando Flores and John Searle and others. But for me, it was a personal discovery that as economists and social scientists, we are actively participating in the creation of the subject of our study, right? Yeah. Take a simple example. Keynes helped the United States get out of the Great Depression. Now everybody studies Keynes, so Keynesian economics is something that is in the mental models of many people around the world.
Yeah.
So not only did he kind of sensed or observed what worked in the society, he also influenced people as economic agents through his work. And so this is a feedback loop. So we actually, whatever we do with socioeconomic systems, like whatever we learn about socioeconomic systems, is influenced by the actual reality. So we see people making decisions, we learn how they make decisions, they see the results of their decisions, but at the same time we interpret those mechanisms and we share those mechanisms with the world, and that has impact, right? As I was working on that, I was also, that was the first time I got familiar with systems thinking and complexity theory and these kind of domains, which fascinated me. So I kind of realized that we actually live in a world that is not as much given as we usually think. It is a product of our design. And so that's one thing. The second line is I was working as intercultural communication consultant and primarily doing negotiations. And having received very good training in different cultures, particularly Russian and Chinese culture, so I noticed that we learned about the differences, but we never covered common humanity, something that unites us. Because if I was born in China, I would have been Chinese by culture. And that common humanity was shining through the work. So I have several stories, and I don't think we have time now, but at some point I could tell you some story, maybe even today if there's time.
That would be great. Yes, to have these stories.
Yeah, you want a story about common humanity?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. So as kind of a simple story is, for example, even when I was a student. So after my bachelor's degree, I spent 1 year in China. And I remember, a hot day, we were waiting for a bus with my Russian friends and discussing, we had nothing to do. So we were discussing how the history would go if Newton didn't have this apple, fall on his head. It's a myth, by the way, as far as I understand, but it's still like, it's a powerful story. So we were discussing like what the possibilities would be if gravity was not discovered at that time. And our Chinese friend was curious about what we were talking about, and asked us. We translated that to him, and he was very intrigued. And he said, like, "Is it normal in Russia to discuss this kind of things?" And said, yeah, sure. And we understood a little bit about the cultural differences. So, these abstract questions, absolutely detached from reality, is not necessarily something that is normal to be discussed in China. So he said, well, if I talk about something like that with my Chinese friends, they would think I have a mental health issue.
Wow.
It's like, well, yeah, great, and that's the difference. So that these are the differences we learned. So we were not surprised at all. We said, yeah, sure, we know that there's this difference. But then something interesting happened. So he said, he got quiet for a few moments, and he said, sometimes I have ideas, and I cannot discuss it with anybody. And then he started sharing these very creative, super interesting ideas, absolutely wild sometimes from our perspective. Such as, for example, one that I remember is, what if we teach moles to dig in holes in one direction and build metro that way?
Okay, interesting.
So it's like a lot of creative things, and basically then after sharing a few of them, he got sad again and said, but I cannot talk with anybody about that because people will think I'm crazy.
Yeah.
So, and when we think about, lack of, the cultural space for reflection is different in different cultures, but it doesn't mean that we have different capacity for reflection or different need even for reflection as human beings, right? It is just the culture creates the spaces for us that may or may not be encouraging that natural capacity. And that is one of the stories about the humanity shining through. So that kind of made me curious about how can we use the understanding of cultural differences and understanding of common humanity. What is the human nature or natures? What is the capacity for our interactions? What is the capacity for our co-creation? To come up with spaces and practices that allow us to co-create as diverse as we are, but also as human and common as we are, something that we all understand and are happy with. So instead of positional bargaining, when you try to understand the differences, to actually, advance your position at the expense usually of the other side, or often of the other side. And of course, a good negotiation is a win-win. But still, I mean, you basically measure success primarily by the advantage of your side, like the benefit of your side. And then basically controlling what kind of information you share is one of the kind of very important practices of negotiation, right? When you share things. But how can we transcend that, and how can we be open about that? I'm sure you would understand that, especially in the context of theory.
So this is another question now. How can we first individual impact or influence culture? This is one. Secondly, then if we are in a certain culture, any culture, how can individuals go out of the group thinking or the norm and realize there is a change that needs to be happened?
Exactly. So there are many ways to influence culture, because we are at the Institute for Evolution Leadership. We're talking about basically four different interconnected factors. There are cultural factors. So these are cultural practices that are common for a community or a society, and these practices could be contradictory even, or could be different, right? Could be diverse. Within one community, there could be different cultural practices. So there is a potential to amplify some cultural practices and kind of avoid others. So then also we talk about institutional factors. Institutions are kind of formalized ways of interaction, and institutions have power. We could influence institutions by, we can use the institutions, first of all. We can use existing institutions to promote different cultural patterns. And we also can redesign institutions. And we can redesign institutions usually by mechanisms, either by mechanisms that are written within the institutions, that are kind of embedded in the institutions themselves, like there is, like in some democratic countries, actually, basically all democratic countries, there is a process to change the constitution, right? And then if you want to change the constitution, you can do that. Or you can actually create alternative institutions that would be replacing the existing institutions once they get more cultural support, right? The third type of factors are mental factors, mental models. And the culture is kind of an emergent property of multiple mental models of individuals within society. But it's important to also think about individuals, not just the culture. Because individuals have institutional cultural leverage. And if you have someone, for example, in a position of power within a system of influence, like in an institution, the person has mental models. These mental models may or may not be completely influenced by the local culture. It could be that the person studied abroad, or the person actually had certain family situation or some other things. And then understanding that mental model, and in some cases, changing that mental model through generative conversation, for example, by creating certain experiences for the person, by being open and vulnerable and sharing your worldview with the person and your perspective, could be very powerful, because it could trigger institutional change, or it can trigger kind of a cultural change through institutional leverage, right? So we talk about cultures, we talk about institutions, we talk about mental models or worldviews, and we talk about all the material limitations. For example, imagine a village, and there is no enough food in the village to feed everybody. You can meditate and work on mental models. You can create dialogic spaces, or you can change the institutional structure of the village, but people will still not have food unless there is the physical action to grow food or to get food from somewhere, right? So we need to actually deal with the material reality, with the observer independent reality, right? And if this food is controlled by certain people who have institutional power within the village, right? And there is an institutional barrier for them, even if they want to share this food with others, there is an institutional barrier for them to do that. You need to work on institutions. If there is there is an institutional mechanism to distribute food properly to everybody, but the person in power is not using that institutional power, you have a mental model issue. You have to deal with the mental model of the person. And if you have, for example, institutional structure that allows or requires a distribution of this food, but people are hiding the food in their houses and they don't share it, even though institutionally they have to, you have a cultural issue. And also, but this cultural issue could be that, you know, these people don't have enough food for themselves even, right? So it's not cultural issues, it's a material issue as well, right? So assessing these distinctions gives people a framework to come up with solutions that are relevant to what is going on, right? So that's how people can change cultures, right? And, you know, through different other factors, through institutions, through mental models, through generative conversations. It's not an easy process. No. It is, and also you're not just replacing one culture with another. You are influencing part of the culture. You're actually amplifying the patterns that you want to see. And also you're doing it in partnership, because systems change is not about coming to the system and then rearranging everything as you wish, right? It is actually sensing, connecting with different stakeholders, creating spaces, hosting spaces for them to come together and understand each other better. And through that, a new reality emerges. You are not as a change agent. You are not actually in charge of what the system will be. It's not up to you to decide, right? But you can hold certain purpose and certain vision for like less suffering and more sustainability and more justice. But then you also need to acknowledge what is justice for others. Different stakeholder groups. What is sustainability for others? What do they care about? How do they frame that? And then understanding their perspective genuinely. And also inviting them to understand your perspective and each other's perspectives, you can actually create spaces for really deep transformative change culturally.
And then I believe then change will not happen unless people wanted to make that change happen. Because change coming from them and through them, through that system. And here, if I want to shift gear a little bit, actually, I was intrigued by what you said earlier, when you said the system now for the consulting or for the work with the corporate is setting up for failure and destroying sometimes an organization or institution. So what exactly now the difference between what they are doing and what you are doing in evolution leadership?
So what Manuel thought, as far as I understand, is more global impact, but also impact on local communities. So it's not necessarily, at that point, especially in the 90s, it was not necessarily a kind of a failure of the organization itself. It was the impact on the communities, impact on the environment, and things like that. Today, the situation, my assessment of the situation is very, very different, because now organizations, even if they want to continue doing business as usual, they are setting their organization for failure as well, because of conscious consumption, because of our changing regulation, because of the changing economy, changing markets, changing, just very practical factors. Because even if you didn't care about communities, you didn't care about the environment, you didn't care about the impact, you thought that, the the most logical thing you can do is to become successful yourself and make your organization successful. And then if everybody does that, then everybody would be fine. Without thinking systemically about your context, you're actually acting in a way that would be at odds with what people expect you to do. A lot of people, including your customers, including your investors, including like a lot of people and stakeholders around that. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is still this, so there is hope that the institutional structure and the cultures globally are changing to actually facilitate, catalyze that organizational transformation. However, there's also the inertia of the system. And there is a lot of greenwashing, sugarcoating, and all these different practices like astroturfs. I saw a kind of research from the Academy of Management colleagues that at least 50% of Fortune 500 companies have astroturf, which is fake social movements. They basically create something that people perceive as a social movement, but in fact it's sponsored by the corporation. It's usually staffed by employees of the corporation, and it advances a cause that would increase profits, right? So we have a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of really bad things going on, and also there is this. It's very hard to change practices when the change is not genuine, right? When you're trying to like do things like create corporate social responsibility program of teaching something to young people, and then in fact you're loading this program with some ideology that benefits your business.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, I see a lot of that. But at the same time, there is a huge force and trend that I see of digging deeper and looking at what is required to do really transformative work. And in the long run, even if in the midterm, I think for any organization not to think about it is a strategic failure.
Yeah. So you mentioned also that systematic thinking. So from your point of view, what does system thinking mean?
Yeah, right. And I know that here in the States, a lot of people use systematic and systemic interchangeably. I'm following Manuel's coaching that systematic is more like you have a very structured approach. Yeah. Not necessarily systemic. So it could be doing something systematically, but it's one thing. It's absolutely laser focused and it's not considering the context. And systemic means that you're actually considering the different factors and the relationships among these different factors. So I will talk about systems thinking, and it is a domain of knowledge that comes from systems thinking, from mechanical engineering and all that, but then also biology, chemistry, and and then social sciences. It is a domain of knowledge that studies relationships, right? So that creates emergent properties. So something that that was not possible before certain elements came together, in certain kind of relationships. And an example from really. Not even a complex system. Look at the car, imagine any car and imagine a bunch of parts of that car like lying around. Same things, same molecules, even same parts. But here you see a car, you can drive it. And here you see a bunch of things that is garbage. Unless you actually put these things into a relationship that creates a car. That's systems thinking. So, right? And in our society, very often we analyze the parts and we try to change the parts or interact with the parts, and we don't necessarily see the relationships. And in this case, our interventions or our actions are very short-sighted. And they can only be successful if we don't challenge those relationships. If we replace one part with another that fits the system well. That's the traditional leadership development.
Yeah.
Right. Or if we actually consider the impact of changing one little thing on all these different factors. Now, one more thing is that when we talk about the car, it's a complicated system. It's not a complex system. We can actually predict, we can actually map out all the cause and effects in that system and predict pretty much with scientific with kind of scientific precision what kind of outcome we will get. In societies and social systems, we have complex systems. There are too many factors in place. There's no way we can kind of make a little bit of approximations, but there are too many factors. They're changing too fast. And there is a whole new set of tools and methods to work with those kind of systems that most of all involves bringing stakeholders together and facilitating system reflecting on itself rather than trying to bring experts and give you policy decisions.
And this is the complexity. There is no cause and effect between things, so that what makes it complex. So now
I would just real quickly, if I may, I wouldn't say there is no cause and effect. It's just it's impossible to know the causes and effects in place. That's how I would frame it.
So now from your point of view, Fyodor, how do you perceive and view the world?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Because how do we know what the world is, right? In one of our competencies called Emotions and Generative Language, we talk about speech acts, and there are assertions versus assessments, which is basically, assertions of facts versus assessments and sharing your opinions. The world we live in is very, very big. And it's impossible to make your assessment about the state of the world without relying on other people's assertions and assessments. So, and here is what's happening. Like we have certain kind of assessments of the world that we've framed, and then there is confirmation bias. So we start picking the evidence or the different information that confirms our assessments. So in this case, everybody's assessment is biased in a certain way. However, there are certain ways to minimize that bias, to make grounded assessments, to really look for assertions. So for example, if there is, and also there is a collective process, right? So there is accountability that people in institutions have in our world, and that's how you can actually expand your own capacity to make assertions about what you see with your own eyes, and actually rely on other people's assertions. So for example, temperature, global temperature. There is a network, there are several networks of independent measurement stations. And it's very hard to falsify that at scale. So you can actually rely on that, right? Probably, right? So you can make a decision to rely on that. And there are other things like that. And based on the assertions and assessments that I see around me that I trust, we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble ecologically, we are in deep trouble socially, and we're in deep troubles institutionally. Which means that there is a possibility of a civilization collapse. That's my assessment. That's not an assertion, that's an assessment. But that informs my work in many ways.
And from where we are getting this trouble or problem in civilization?
So obviously one of the factors is that we live in a finite planet with finite resources, right? So there are many of us that are, I guess almost 8 billion people right now. And if everybody wants to live like, the standard of living that has been established by countries that pioneered global capitalism, then we wouldn't have these resources. Like there is this assessment of the Earth, the kind of the overshoot day, when we kind of it's an estimate of when at one point within 1 year, we as humanity used the resources of our planet that still allow that is still within the regenerative capacity of the planet that can still be renewed. This day is usually becoming early and early in the year every year, except this year because of the coronavirus, I guess. I have to look into that, but still, that's one thing. So we have resources that it's not enough to sustain the lifestyle we have and to sustain the number of us that within the lifestyle. There's plenty of resources, I believe, to sustain all of us and even more with a different lifestyle, right? But the combination of lifestyle and the increase of the population is unsustainable. But also, most importantly, the global system that emphasizes growth, unlimited economic growth, is at odds with that finity. And it's very hard. It's like it's important to kind of reflect on the fundamental influence of that growth ideology on everything we do. So, for example, if a CEO of like a large corporation tries to do something that would impact the shareholders in a negative way, the CEO would lose a job. If the board of directors would just fire the CEO. If the board of directors sides with the CEO, then the Wall Street would just react to that, and the board would be in trouble, right? The shareholders would sue and all that. So the entire legal system, the entire financial system, is like pushes everybody. Oh yeah, and by the way, if the CEO is fired, then the CEO loses the lifestyle and wouldn't be able probably to work again and stuff like that. So there are certain factors that keep the current cultures and institutions in place that are at odds, right? And even when you create certain kind of mechanisms to support, I don't know, like for example, you create a development fund for the poorest populations of the poorest countries, and these funds kind of uses money to do blended financing, for example, with the private capital. That they still would pick the companies that would be potentially profitable for and that would give the returns to investors at the end that investors expect. So, and I know, for example, about research from the University of Melbourne about what types of companies actually benefit local communities. And these type of companies usually are not potential unicorns or potential like IPO or like big acquisition type of thing, right? But investment funds that are set up to support businesses locally, they say, and many of them maybe believe that they are here to support local communities, but they would be out of business if they don't express a bias towards, like, in favor of those companies that support global capitalism. And this is one of the things that we need to rethink. I know that Otto Scharmer, one of people from whom you learned, calls it capitalism 4.0, for example, right? How can we transform the current capitalist system? Some people call it differently, but there's definitely a fundamental need to redesign the very foundations of our economic activities, our lifestyles, and our value system, our cultures and institutions that support of that, which is a big challenge that we and many others are trying to address.
So now this period that we are living, which is the pandemic, is it gonna influence the future?
Yes, but in what way? We don't know yet, right? Because again, it's very hard to play prophet and try to predict the future. The future is in our hands in some way, but also in our collective hands, not in our individual hands.
Interesting. How the future is in our hand?
Yeah, in our collective hands. Imagine we can do anything as a humanity. Imagine we are aligned, we are coherent in our actions. We can imagine we can instantly communicate with other 8 billion people and share the purpose of figuring that out together. We can do anything. The problem is, try to do that alone and you'll have no impact. Try to do that with some other people and you might have some local impact, but not necessarily global impact. So it is a very, very tricky and complex thing, trying to coordinate your efforts with other people. The good thing is that other people are trying to do the same as you are, right? So you're not alone by definition. It's like there are many, many different people and organizations and others that try to figure that out. And as soon as you are doing this in community of practice, you're like kind of building a network and then turning it into a community of practice or joining a community or different communities of practice. That accelerates learning and that accelerates impact. And also, of course, engaging with folks who are who share different opinions, different worldviews, and inviting them into conversations. So that's how you accelerate cross-network and understanding, right? And cross-network, and you can expand, hosting diverse groups with people from different networks and trying to create generative dialogue spaces for them would build even more coherence across different movements, right? And that is something that we can do. But it's not guaranteed. The pandemic, actually, one good thing about the pandemic is that it disrupted some patterns. So, which means that the inertia is no longer there for many people. They're more open for change. They're more open to different options. And if there are prototypes or if there are invitations that are compelling enough for them, now more than ever they would be willing to explore those invitations. That's good. The bad thing is, of course, the death and suffering that it imposes on people. It's not easy, and also that there is a reaction to this pandemic that could actually bring us onto a completely different path that is not generative, that is not collaborative. This could be isolation. This could be more control. There could be more fear. And it is up to us, basically, to which possibility we personally are contributing. And the invitation is to contribute to more collaboration, more solidarity, more understanding, more generative spaces for a better future.
What the main pattern that we need to hold collectively?
I would say a little bit more awareness of what informs our decisions, because in many times we are not aware of what informs our decisions. Right? We're just going with the patterns that were established by our family, by our culture, and becoming more aware of those, and also becoming a little bit more aware of the impact of what we do and say. And in the spirit of that, holding paradoxes, engaging with others, developing our capacity to hold spaces for these conversations, developing our understanding of language, because language is the kind of the way our institutions work and the way our cultures work in many ways, right? So understanding the language and understanding our human natures, understanding how we interact with each other, what capacities do we have, what capacities are encouraged by our cultures and what capacities are suppressed by cultures, and make a little bit more conscious choices about what we actually want. If our culture encourages violence, but we don't necessarily want that violence, how can we influence the culture to be more to be more encouraging of peaceful solutions rather than violent solutions, right? Things like that, right? So it is a tricky thing, but again, I would say becoming more aware of what impacts us and what we impact, being in relationship with others, even if they're different, and holding the paradoxes, and that's okay. Multiple things could be true at the same time, and not giving up, I would say, because in some cases this work is hard. because it's much easier to just do whatever you've done before, and it's uncomfortable. And being okay with that discomfort, I think, is key in these times.
So now we are approaching to, let's say, last question. So now, what are the biggest challenge that you are working on?
Yeah, well, let me probably talk about some of the most recent things.
Either personally or collectively. But
I'm personally in the space of deep reflection these days because of some things that I witnessed recently, especially about some, I would call it corruption going on in terms of in the field of change. I want to make sure that I contribute to things that really work and to things that are really meaningful, and that do the change instead of sugarcoating the status quo and the business as usual. Because systemic change is becoming like a mainstream, and there are programs at very respectable places that I scream at when I look at what they're actually doing. And also the support structures, because we work with leaders, right? So we basically invite them to explore some of these competencies and practice them, but also they're working within the environment that actively discourages that many times. And we all need support structures. So it's a great challenge to create powerful enough structures that would compete with the system of influence for the to compete. I mean, who could compare to the system of influence, right? The power of the system of influence, to give change agents, evolutionary leaders, that kind of space where they could take care of their mental health, that could take care of their financial status, like financial ability to, like, the ability to sustain their lives, right? And at the same time do the change work, right? Because as soon as you try to really create some trouble in a good way, then it's very easy for you to get pushed back by the system. And I know that we are running out of time, but if possible, just a little story.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, for example, a lot of leaders locally with whom we work, they, without any training, intuitively, they do the right thing, right? They just sense that. And we, one of our finalists of Evolution Future Challenge from Kenya, is that example. So she herself was from a poor community in rural Kenya, and she kind of built herself up and wanted to come back and educate girls in her community, and do a leadership development program for girls. But very soon she realized that if she really cares about the girls and what happens to them, she cannot just work with them several hours a day, for example. She needs to understand that their families don't have money to buy food sometimes, or to send them to school. There is home violence going on. There are all these different things. At some point, she found herself hosting these girls and their mothers escaping home violence at her home. So she had to develop different things like microfinance to empower local businesses. But then people started buying TV sets on this money. So she started teaching how to do business. Then, men started taking this money and going and drinking and gambling. So it's home violence prevention services. Then it is, while this all was happening, girls needed hygiene products and school supplies to go to schools, to keep going to school. So she was doing all that, right? And then, when people like that come to, for example, Open IDEO Challenge, and they get harassed for exactly the right thing, because there's still a Silicon Valley mentality. As a social entrepreneur or a nonprofit, to have a laser focus on one thing. Yeah. And yes, if you don't want to change your context, you can focus on one thing supported by that context. But if you want to change the entire community or the entire society, you have to take responsibility through partnerships or in-house services or spin-offs. You have to take care of that. And when these people come, so she shared a lot of troubles with the mainstream support system, the funders and mentors and all that, because they basically, it's like they are pushing her to abandon what works. Wow. And actually create something that is not what works. Or they do things like, for example, she says, I don't take money from U.S. foundations. So why? Because they gave me like $500 in the early days, and they still pressed me to create reports for 4,000 girls a year that I'm serving. So I spent more resources that I could have spent on my community to create these reports over these years. So it was a kind of a hook to extract value instead of give value, right? And these support systems are inadequate by definition. That's one of the biggest challenges we face: how to not just give leadership development opportunities to folks, but how to kind of create alternative support systems or influence existing support systems, so that these people have enough space to take care of themselves while doing the change work, right? And that is probably, you know, the biggest thing that person I'm concerned about right now.
Wow. Thank you, Fyodor, for this. This is really informative. And thank you very much for being here all the time. So appreciating this. And looking forward, yes, to have you in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Marwan. It's a pleasure to be working with you, and I'm really glad about this opportunity to reconnect and then talk about important things.
Thanks.